Welcome to the Lore Tours of Intergalactic Aerospace Expo 2951. This is where I walk the floor of IAE and tell you all about the history of the ships on display and their creators. Now join me on the floor for your tour. It's Anvil Day here at the floor, and we're going to talk to you about ships, about these ships, and about the company that makes it. So, without further ado, let's get started with who is Anvil? What is Anvil Aerospace? What do they do? And the simplest answer is Anvil Aerospace was sort of an old company. It has its roots in an old company called Case Aerospace, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But it was founded by J. Harris Arnold in 2773, Anvil that is, and specifically it was inspired by all of Case Aerospace's designs. Arnold has struggled to get his initial designs to the military, especially since Arnold was working towards the end of the Meser era. And for those of you who don't know what the Meser era was, it was a fairly bad time for humanity. And if you were trying to make ships, you would better have been from Anvil, from Aegis Dynamics. And if you weren't, you're probably not going to get stuff into the military. Well, Aegis or RSI. But Anvil desperately tried to bring new ideas to the forefront and seemed to not succeed very well. But luckily for J. Harris Arnold and his plucky little company, the Mesers weren't going to be around for long, because by the end of that century, the Mesers had been deposed, and the new UEE was looking for some kindler, gentler, new faces on the block to help them recoup their image and replace a lot of their aging Aegis designs. In steps Anvil Aerospace, and the rest is history. Let's get started with the most recent part, or one of the most recent parts of that history, the Anvil Aero. Now, the Anvil Aero itself was built fairly recently, in the late 2940s, specifically during the gold mine of light fighter design. The aging Gladius had been the mainline fighter for the UEE for hundreds of years at this point. But it was starting to show its age, and it wasn't particularly good at dealing with Vandal or other such problems, especially as technologies had advanced with ships like the Cutlass, and of course a lot of military surplus ships out there as well. So as the UEE began to phase out the Gladius, they were looking for replacements. Here comes the Anvil Aero, which is the plucky little replacement for the Gladius with lots of firepower. It keeps the same design style. To let you know, let me go into third person so I can show you. The design style of Aegis, or of Anvil, is very distinct. If you see up here, if I get a up view of this. If you see here, that central turret, that central circle, is a hallmark of just about every single Anvil design, and I'll show it to you on every single one of their ships. It is part of the old Case Aerospace design that J. Harris Arnold adopted, and Anvil has continued ever since. It's even in the logo. If you look at Anvil Aerospace, it has a circle with wings. Circle and wings. It's literally what this company's design is. So it keeps the classic Anvil Aerospace design with some new innovations. It's fast, it hits pretty hard, but it is not quite as tanky as its other cousins. Other than that, we don't know much about the Anvil Aero, and perhaps we'll learn a little bit more about it in the coming years. Next, we're going to talk about an interesting ship. Now, this ship has most recently gotten its lore about, I think, this year, and its lore is kind of twisted. At the end of the 29th century, two gentlemen approached the UEE Navy with a breakthrough revelation. They built a stealth torpedo that could not be picked up on sensors, possibly even invisible. However, this torpedo required a constant guidance lock from fairly close. Thus, none of the ships that were built at the time could do such a task. requiring a brand new bomber to be built to handle this stealth torpedo. As always, the UAE turned to its favorite bomber manufacturer, or its favorite manufacturer period, Anvil Aerospace, who delivered the T6 Gladius. The T6-8 was a prototype. It was built, tested, and ready to go. And by the time it had been built and ready to go, it was then that the UAE Navy realized that the whole thing was a scam. I don't know if the two individuals were ever arrested, but the torpedo they delivered was simply a general torpedo with some off-the-shelf modified parts to make it look more advanced. Embarrassingly, there was a lot of money spent on this project specifically to develop this new bomber. So instead, the UAE decided to use what it had built for trying to find the silver lining at the end of this whole terrible debacle. Because the ship had been designed to linger in areas, it had to have some defensive turrets to be able to stave off fighters while the lock was there and the pilot was flying around. Luckily, this is very, very classic Anvil. They're very good at building twin-seater fighters and bombers like this. It's quite literally their blood. So they built the Gladiator to very extracting standards, and it did its job well. But because its job was not available anymore, they had to change all of the aspects to make it more of a conventional torpedo bomber. Luckily, the requirements for the torpedo were so large that the Gladiator could carry multiple size 5 torpedoes instead of its single stealth torpedo, and got redesignated as the T8A Gladius. Now, this ship still couldn't really have anything. It really still didn't really have any purpose. There was aging torpedo bombers from Aegis that had to be replaced, which the Gladiator took over, but it was a weird design. It was still designed for carriers, obviously, but the other ones did not have all of the same sort of functionality. The UAE argued that the real reason it was built was to be self-sufficient, be able to defend itself in combat, and that went very poorly in its first ever sorties. So eventually it found its place. The Black Crows, one of the most famous squadrons in the UAE, especially fighting against the Vandul, began to use the T8 Gladiator to great success against the Vandul. But still, this ship required some fighter cover to be most effective. It couldn't survive on its own with just its gunners. However, another odd thing is that this torpedo bay here is modular. It's not just a torpedo bay, it can also be, and I kid you not, a medical rescue bay. That's right. You open up the bay, a bed comes down, you can load somebody on the bed goes back up, locks up, and airtight steel with a auto dock right there to help you out. I don't know who'd want to do this, and you just better hope that your pilot knows the difference between their torpedo bays and medical bays. Make sure they didn't get those mixed up when they're not flying if they're trying to rescue somebody. All right, for that, let's move on to the Carrick. Now, we've been doing a little bit of a series here on the Carrick about its cursed founding, its cursed origins. So I'm not going to be very too detailed, since we have several videos on the Carrick now. You can watch for all of those details. But I'll give you the brief rundown. In the early 29th century, a terrible accident happened with a UAE cruiser that was lost with all hands after investigating a mysterious signal. The people in charge wanted to cover this up, so they did, and realized that at that point they needed something to prevent something like this from happening in the future. So they gave a no-bid contract to build a military survey and pathfinder ship to Anvil Aerospace, who built the Carrick. Now, the Carrick was and still is one of the most advanced exploration vessels ever produced. It is incredibly self-sufficient, can go on incredibly long-range exploration and survey missions, and can hold a large crew complement with being out in the black for much longer than most other ships. However, it's also got its own past. Since it's already founded on tragedy, several Carricks have disappeared mysteriously, and at least one Carrick had its entire crew, one Carrick, let's see if I get this right, S1132, got it right. The S1132 disappeared, then reappeared 30 years later with its crew entirely missing. If that sounds cool, I got some of those videos up there for you to watch, from the spooky Carrick videos to the actual Carrick expose we did a while ago. So check that out if you're more interested in that. Now, let's move on to the OG of Anvil, the Anvil Hurricane. Now, if you remember at the very beginning, I talked about how Anvil was really founded by, started as a company called Case Aerospace. Well, Leonard Case was an aerospace designer from RSI who had a bad time developing his first concept because of so many bureaucrats, marketers, all of those other people sticking their nose into the design process. He was not a fan of that. So after he released a fairly successful luxury yacht for RSI, he quit and founded his own company, calling it Case Aerospace. Now, Case Aerospace did fairly well. It came out with the Star Sloop. Look at the actual name here so I can have it. Cosmo Sloop. Ha! Yeah, sorry about that. The Cosmo Sloop. In 2604. It was met with good reviews. People enjoyed it, said it was better than the last luxury vessel he did. But unfortunately, shortly after, the Second Tavaran War happened, and a lot of people weren't really looking for luxury pleasure yachts. Thus, his company was struggling through the war, but so was the entire UEE. Now, during this time period, the UEE was completely caught off guard by the brand new Tavaran incursion using a special type of shields known as the phalanx shield. This shield used multiple operators, usually say a fighter would operate with a pilot and then a shield operator that would continually move the shields to defend against oncoming fire, and was able to essentially pull all power to one shield or another. This was so effective that it would prevent most but the biggest and toughest rounds from penetrating any Tavaran shields, meaning when you scaled this up to capital class, they had a very tough time. The UE had a very tough time breaking the shields of these new, large, and very tough Tavaran capital ships. So the UE was desperate, and they asked for help from the civilian market, asking for a new ship specifically to counter Tavaran twin-seater fighters. And Case Aerospace answered with the Case Hurricane. Now, what you'll note about the Case Hurricane here, now known as the Anvil Hurricane, is that it does have some front guns. These are two large guns designed for the pilot. However, back here, you see this little hatch. Again, this is the origin of the Anvil design language, by the way. Big circle in the center and two wings on the side. That's why all of the Anvil ships kind of look like that. Then we're going to take a look up here. A little shot there. But these are pilot-controlled guns. 4 ballistics is usually what they use. And these 4 ballistics were very, very effective. A Hurricane would fly in towards a Tavaran target and fire at the target. The Tavaran defenders would probably swing their shields around and block the incoming attacks. However, another Hurricane would be close behind it. And as the first Hurricane overshot, it would do a wide turn and come back at another angle. Eventually, you would have Hurricanes coming in at different angles as they would follow one another in these big, looping, swinging attacks, which would mean that the Tavaran shield operators were not able to direct the shields very effectively and would get overwhelmed and destroyed. Luckily, it didn't require many Hurricanes to do this to smaller ships, and these ships were very effective against sub-cap ships as well as some capital ships as well because of these swarm tactics. And because it was cheap to build and rugged, they came back home pretty often and were not too difficult to operate. Though it did require some retraining because no UEE pilot had ever been designed or ever flown a ship like this in the past. So Case used the enemy's own designs against them with this and became the inspiration for all of Anvil Aerospace's designs. Now, Case unfortunately died shortly after the Second Tavaran War, and his company would fall into ruin and be purchased for spare parts. And when J. Harris Arnold started up Anvil, he was actually sued because of how similar his designs were to the old Case Aerospace designs. So Arnold purchased the rights to all of the Case Aerospace designs, just bought them outright, and so he wouldn't have to get sued anymore. And during the increase in the Vanduul War, Anvil decided that the best thing they could do to help out the UEE is bring back their iconic ship that helped defeat the Second Tavaran War, defeat the Tavarans in the Second Tavaran War, the Case Hurricane, with some upgrades and advantages. So there you go, that's the Hurricane. And last for this floor, we're going to look at the U6, I want to say? U9. The U9A Hawk. Now, the Hawk is the result of Project Brawler. Specifically, the UEE was looking for a ship that could dogfight at very close range, support ground attacks, and escort logistic ships pretty closely. These were odd things that, while a typical fighter could do them, they all usually weren't good at all of them. So, 3 companies entered the competition for Project Brawler: Anvil Aerospace, Aegis Dynamics, and Drake Interplanetary. And when Drake Interplanetary entered, they entered essentially a Cutlass. This was in 2935, by the way. So they were rejected out of hand. So that left Aegis and Anvil. Aegis created the Aegis Dynamics Bearcat. It was a very well designed, one of the first original designs from Aegis in a very long time. It was a very well designed fighter, bespoke, built from the ground up to do what they wanted them to do. Problem is that Aegis they built a good fighter, they didn't build a good ground attack fighter. So in the dogfighting tests and escort tests, it did very well. Outperformed its competition, in fact. But it completely failed and nearly blew up, nearly exploded in a ground attack roles. While Anvil decided to do something a little different. They built the Hawk, which is not just a ship. It is a piece of kind of scrapped together spare parts. This ship was built off of parts from the Hornet. And since the Hornet at this time was the mainline fighter for the UEE, there were lots of parts for Hornets laying around. That made this very easy to maintain, and pretty much its logistics supply already existed. On top of that, using these cobbled together parts, the Anvil Aerospace built a ship that did exactly what the UEE wanted. It did exactly what the UEE wanted, and no more than that. As a result, it won the contract for Project Brawler, and the U9A Hawk was entered into service. Only one squadron of Hawks really exists. They were deployed to, I believe, Castra to deal with a threat there. And they were so good that the pirates who they were attacking essentially just gave up and left. They just decided to use other means to achieve their goals and did everything they could to avoid what the Hawk was great at because they were so afraid of it. So the UEE has several Hawks. They're more or less used, but they're very rare. They're tool on toolbox kind of thing. But bounty hunters saw the stats and the whole deal with the Hawk, and they loved this idea. So when Anvil did what Anvil does best and took its military ship to the civilian market, it was absolutely devoured by the bounty hunters of the verse. In fact, it was so popular, it started to get aftermarket kits. including the Dire Hawk and the Shadow Hawk. The Dire Hawk is a regular hawk with more up guns, more weaponry on it, and the Shadow Hawk is a stealth variant. Last we heard, there is some rumors that the Dire Hawk is in production in some way as an official variant of the Hawk, but we just have to wait and see. Now let's head over to the other halls and talk about the venerable Hornet. We're back here with the Hornet. The F7A Hornet. Well, F7A and F7C. Now this right here is the F7A Mark II. We don't have the F7A Mark I here, but it's fairly similar to the F7C. Similar design, at least. The F7A Mark II, well, the F7A platform, was built shortly after the fall of the Mezzers. The UAE was looking to get rid of its aging Aegis Avenger platform. It was good, it was well liked, but it was also old and not very suited for modern space combat. That guy looked like he had a heck of a time. So as they were trying to roll it out, they were looking for new companies to help build this. And the company that applied to build this new medium fighter was the young, up-and-coming Anvil Aerospace. They'd only produced one other ship before this for the military, which was the Terrapin, which was a reconnaissance vehicle. So what came out of this bid was the F7A Hornet. It was, to say it was beloved is, I think, it's a little too soft. It's not quite urgent enough. This ship is the best fighter in human history. It has more kills and more sorties than any other fighter that has ever existed in mankind. It has existed for a little under 150 years. Very modified, obviously, since we have the Mark II version here. But it is the premier fighter of the UAE. Now, here's what Anvil did to make it so good. This also kind of started the Anvil tradition of what they're really known for today, which is a flying gun platform. All of their weapons, all of their aircraft and spacecraft are just guns with wings. You can just see the sheer amount of firepower that this thing has just on its, small frame. On top of that, to be able to fit onto pretty much any carrier ship in the UAE, they built these wings to swing back for more storage, which gave it a lot more stackability. It was very easy to kind of really cram as many Hornets as you can onto a carrier. And on top of all of this, its front nose here, which is a scoop to be able to help refuel hydrogen fuel in situ, as well as decent maneuverability and a lot of armor. This ship is the perfect and became the perfect ship for combating the Vanduul Scythe and Vanduul heavy fighters, because it pretty much matched them toe for toe, even though it was lighter and more maneuverable. R.A. O'Reilly, famous pilot from Squadron 42, once said, "Give me a fully loaded Hornet, and I will shake the gates of heaven." That is how much the UAE loves the Hornet. Now, the other thing that made the Hornet so legendary is that shortly after they built the Hornet and was approved by the UAE, Anvil asked the UAE if they could build a civilian version of the Hornet. No other manufacturer had done such a thing in the history of the UAE. Build a military platform and then say, can we sell this also to the civilian market? And the UAE, which was dealing with a very undefended frontier, Vanduul attacks, and still in, being a little cautious about the Xi'an, whom they've had a several hundred-year Cold War for, that had just recently ended, that just recently ended, found this an amazing idea, because they could give this ship, or some version of this ship, to mercenaries and to bounty hunters and to militia to help defend the frontier. They thought this was an amazing idea to help fill out the ranks. And it became pretty well beloved with the civilian market as well. So for almost 100 years, the Hornet served admirably with some slight updates, looking something more akin to that, the F7A. With its civilian counterpart, the F7C, which is still remains fairly the same as it was back then. But in the early 30th century, the F7A was showing its teeth. It was getting a little long in the tooth. It was getting a little long. She was old. She was getting old, and other Vanduul were becoming wise to how to defeat it. And of course, there were lots of other new ships in the market that could take on a Hornet in one-to-one combat. So they decided to go back to the drawing board and completely retrofit the F7A Mark I, now known as F7A Mark I, from the ground up, and created the Mark II. It's faster, more maneuverable, sleeker, with all of the same kind of properties that made it very well beloved in the military before that. So yeah, that's the F7A. Let's go over to the F7C over here. This is, of course, the F7C. After the F7A Mark II refresh, the F7C got its own lines and updates as well. Keeping its same chassis, it has a lot of interior upgrades that the older F7Cs didn't have, plus a lot more modularity options that weren't available at the time of its initial release. There's still the F7C right here, the time-honored F7C. This here is the first kind of specialty ship that they ever built. This is called the Hornet Wildfire. This is based off of one of the most famous Hornet aces of the UAE, who I mentioned earlier, Aria Riley. This is her loadout for her, or something similar to her loadout for her Hornet. With its own little special customized livery, I can't say that word, livery, and its own sweet little nose art right here. So, yeah. But along with this new update, they also came out with two new specialties. Well, three new specialties other than the Wildfire. The F7C, I think? Let's see what its actual name is. The F7CR. F7CR Hornet Tracker. This is a command and control vehicle as well as basically an AWACS turned into a fighter. It still has some of the capabilities of defending itself, and it has a large radar dome on the back that can function as a communications and sensors platform. And then we also have the F7CS, also known as the Hornet Ghost. This is a Hornet that has been fitted with specialized paint and armor to make its signature incredibly low, to allow it to sneak up on enemies and attack, or just go under the radar. But it has to sacrifice some of its power for some of its more stealthy capabilities. And then the creme de la creme, the cream of the crop, the top of the wok, whatever you want to say it, of civilian Hornet craft, the F7CM Super Hornet. Now, this ship was built with conjunction with the most famous militia in UAE history, the Bremen Defense Force. These boys are so good at their jobs that they're pretty much the model for all militias in the UAE, so how to defend their own systems. And they've been active since before the fall of the Mezzers. So they worked with the Bremen Defense Force, basically said, what is your wish list for a Hornet? If you wanted a new Hornet, what would you want? And that's what they gave them. The F7CM is almost exactly what an F7A is. Slightly different, can't fully put it in there, but it is the closest to military spec you can get. Plus, it also has a second seat, a Rio seat in the back, which could be used to lock down for prisoner transports or just for all of the other options, managing power, guns, missiles, so on and so forth. So this is the Super Hornet. There's also one that's not present here, which is called the Heartseeker, which is Super Hornet with a nice little nose art there as well. But yeah, those are the Hornets. Let's go take a little more step back into Anvil's history, learning about some of its oldest and then its most recent, well, not most recent, but one of its most recent additions. Here we go with this haul for Anvil, specifically with the Anvil Terrapin. Now, the Anvil Terrapin is the first ever ship sold by the UEE, purchased by the UEE, made by Anvil. At the end of the Meser era, the UEE was undergoing a large retrofit of its forces. And what that meant was they needed something that was small, didn't require a lot of crew, but could still linger in an area that was very hostile for a very long time, intercept messages, or just detect and track the movements of enemy forces in a system, and then return back with all its information. A forward scout, one that could survive for longer than it needed to and is able to be deployed from carriers. Anvil stepped forward and took up the challenge, and they did it so well that they had to make some modifications. So all of these armor platings are twofold. One, they're there to protect the ship, obviously, but they're so thick that they actually keep in heat. They retain heat fairly well and do not radiate it out much at all, which means that this ship has very low signature and is very easy to maintain stealth. The only problem is that the longer you keep that in, the hotter the ship is going to get, because its coolers couldn't keep up with the heat management. So they built these wings on the side to be able to help air out the actual heat, to allow the heat to escape a little bit more, which then raised their signature a little bit more, to allow it to radiate a little bit more. So this ship is very stealthy, and can be, and it is very tough. It can survive a lot of beatings and get in and get out. It was so impressive, in fact, that after many surveyors and scouts from the UE Navy retired, they would buy military surplus Terrapins and rave about them to their friends and to their colleagues because of how rugged and dependable and how effective they were for their small size and price. Now, this is going to require a little bit more of a story that we'll talk a little bit more again when we talk about Crusader Industries. But this is the Anvil Valkyrie. Now, the Valkyrie has an interesting story. After the UEE built the Terrapin and the Hornet, it was looking to diversify a little bit. They still wanted to sell military ships, but they didn't want to sell combat ships. So they waited for 3 years after the development of the Hornet to submit information to a mega computer, a supercomputer, to calculate what would likely be the next requirements for the UEE. And this computer came out with many different options, but the one that intrigued the Anvil the most was that if the UEE were to try to retake some of the land lost by the Tavaran, they would need assault ships. And the UEE did not have many, if any, assault ships, and most of its ships that were more landing craft were essentially civilian freights and transports that were converted to military craft. They were very fragile, not very effective. So, in secret, they built the Valkyrie. Built it, tested it, got it ready to go. So when the UEE actually decided to ask for military assault transport, they just kind of held out the Valkyrie. This is what you wanted? Here it is. Already built, already tested, ready to go. Very impressed the Admiralty at that one. But what Anvil Industries, Anvil Aerospace didn't know was that the UEE had already done this study. At the end of the Meser era, they came to the understanding that the UEE was lacking in significant transport capabilities. Its capabilities to transport, especially heavy war material, like the Nova tank and other, vehicles like it, was very restricted. And they needed something that could be tough, but also carry large vehicles, support vehicles, and troops straight to the battlefield. But the problem about this study was that it was done at the end of the Meser era, so it got swept up and swept under the rug after all of the chaos and got pulled back out after the new UEE government took over, the new Admiralty took over. And this was the catalyst for the Valkyries for them to ask for the Valkyrie. There's also the catalyst to ask for the Starlifter, and possibly some other things as well. I hate it, but could be also the reason for the Redeemer. So, the Valkyrie is a assault drop ship. It can hold up to 20 troops in airtight compartments. It has a crew of a minimum of, I think, 3, possibly even 5 crew members. Plus, it can also carry at least a few assault craft or assault vehicles like the Dragonfly or the Cyclone, but it can also carry up to 1 Ursa rover or just cargo in the back as well for ammunition or supplies or wounded troops to bring them back to safety. So it has a large capacity for lots of different options, and is still very well loved for its role, being used not only by the UE but civilians as well, as it also has its own civilian run, like all Anvil ships do. And this comes to our almost our final ship. We'll talk about one more ship after this, and well, one ground vehicle. The future of Anvil Aerospace, the F8 Lightning. This was designed specifically to replace the aging F7 Hornet. You'll notice a couple of design features here. One, they have lots of sloping aerodynamic foils on this, and that makes sense for aerodynamics, but it's also armor. The Vandul are they very much enjoy melee combat in space. They like to get up close with their scythes and hit their targets with a large reinforced blade. So these glancing aerodynamic airfoils, I guess, are not just designed for aerodynamics, but also to help deflect and block the attacks coming in from Vandul melee ships. But just like any other Anvil ship, you got guns, you got guns, you got guns, you got guns, and a nice little circular part back here. Can't really see it under there, so I'll have to go. Nice little circular part right here in the back. Boom. Circle with wings, baby. Like I said. And, of course, you have more guns. Guns and armor are what the F7 or the F8 Lightning is all about. Now, there is a civilian version, which is slowly being introduced to the civilian market, but the F7A is also slowly being rolled in and replacing old F7 Hornets and Gladius squadrons as well, as the UE ups its campaign against the Vandul. So, you will be able to see this ship in game shortly, and possibly even purchase one or fight one, near enough. Now with that, let's go from that to a little bit more, from the lofty heights of space down to the dirty muck of the earth. All right, we're down here with some of the more grounded vehicles, as you were. This is the Anvil Aerospace Ballista, though it's better known as the Anvil Aerospace Atlas chassis. This chassis was built before the Ballista and before the new Spartan, specifically as a heavy transport with lots of armor and guns. And this was built during that time when the UE was trying to reinvent itself, and they needed some sort of ground-based anti-aircraft system, which Anvil built the Atlas chassis, used its Atlas chassis to build the Ballista for the UE. These, we know, have been used in combat, at least against the Vandal, well before, well before for the modern times, in the 2860s, 2870s, during the fall of Caliban, I believe. These were used. So the Anvil Ballista is still around and is actively used by both the military and civilians. Now, I've heard this question before as well. Paul, why do civilians need an anti-aircraft gun? And I'll answer that. Aliens. Aliens. They're coming. They're coming for you, especially the Vandal. And if you don't have military-grade hardware, you might just end up dead. So, anti-aircraft guns. Well, missile launchers. SAM sights. Same. Let's talk about the other Anvil Atlas chassis, the Spartan. Now, the Spartan is most recently released to the civilian market, but it is an armored APC. Pretty simple, no frills sort of situation. It has seats, total of 8 troops, plus their gear. It also has some guns for protection, though it does have a lot of armor on it as well, with a driver in the front. Now, here's the cheeky thing. Let's see if I can get this little... It's an Anvil ship. It has the circle. Even it has a circle. It keeps with the Anvil design philosophy. We don't know what the circle does, but it's there. So even their ground vehicles are built the same way as their ships. Now let's talk about the future of Anvil Aerospace, at least in the verse for right now, the Anvil Liberator. Now, this vessel, we don't know a lot of its history. It was just released for concept sale recently. But based off its design and based off of what I know, I can venture a guess that this ship was built around the same time as the Valkyrie, specifically to fill that heavy lift niche of moving transports, of moving people and material from point A to point B, especially during hostile actions. And it does it pretty well. Most recently, Anvil has released this for the civilian market to help alleviate the long-distance travel that can happen, especially in undeveloped systems. And when those undeveloped systems exist, they probably also have lots of violent pirates and the like. So, you need to have some protection. So, thus the Anvil Liberator. That is it for Anvil Aerospace. Thank you for joining us here on the floor of IAE 2951 for our little lore tours. I hope you enjoy this new camera. You probably noticed that. Probably like, wow, Paul's in really crystal, like that's 60 FPS. We've got a brand new camera, so I mean, fiddling with it a little bit here and there, and I wanted to get this done, get that activated before I got this out. So you'll notice this might be a little bit later than I normally would have done, but keep an eye for it, and keep an eye out for the next one we're going to do, which is the Robert Space Industries lore tour. But if you like this, you enjoy lore like this, I do this all the time. I have over 100 videos, hours upon hours upon hours of various content for your digestion of Star Citizen lore. Galactic Historian. Go join us there. Watch all of those other videos. We also have some more lore tours from there as well. Some of them are a little outdated because of camera, but also because of I messed up on some of the details. But those videos that are kind of directly on point, the ones about specific ships or events or people, those ones are fairly well researched. I do say myself. And of course, join us for our Lore Citizen podcast. We do once a month with myself, Algorid, and Jail. We talk about all aspects of lore. All three of us are lore nuts. And you can even listen to that on podcast format. So, as always, remember, if you enjoyed this, like this video, help spread the word. Subscribe, hit the little bell icon, and make sure when you go into the bell icon, you hit all notifications. Otherwise, YouTube will not send you everything you're supposed to get. So make sure you hit that all notifications if you want to subscribe to us and get up-to-date stuff on all of our lore stuff. And like I always say, nope, I'm going to do the right one. And remember, ex historia ad astra.